All right, so I wanted to get back on to the mineral piece of the conversation here today, or at this section of the day. We did cover water to some decent degree, I believe, already, and I don't have a lot more to say about water. Feel free to bring up questions if and when you feel so inspired. There are page 2 and page 3 and page 4 and page 5 are, if you haven't figured it out yet, are in many cases not ordered properly. So make sure you figure out which pages are where. We're going to go through a number of pages here between now and lunch. And also we're going to be reading this this report here. So make sure you got the Seldish report. I would like you to be able to read this fairly well by lunchtime, and it shouldn't be too hard. Make recommendations for yourself based on the Seldish report. Not that big a deal. Before I go into it too far, I want to do some basic background, and I'm going to erase some of this too. All right. So we had a small comment during the break about remineralization. My entree into this whole world came through the remineralization perspective. John Hamaker wrote a book, Survival of Civilization. Was it the name of his book? Something like that. Yeah, I think it was Survival of Civilization, but. So just to step back for a second here, we have this concept in history, at least in the West, in agriculture, as something that started off 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, something about the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. People have this somewhere, vague recesses of memory. High school, which was more or less distant, depending on who you are in the room. For some people, it's not that distant yet. Others of us, it's actually getting to be somewhat distant. I was speaking at a university, I'm not sure when it was, this winter at some point, and I realized, oh my God, these kids are half as old as me. Like, I've had half of my life since college. I was like, whoa, I am maybe getting a little bit old. Anyway, older. Or something. There's got to be another way to frame that. I actually got a degree in history at university. That's what I formally studied. If you look at history and you look at sort of major agricultural civilizations, and you look at the ones that are still around and have been doing agriculture in the same spot for thousands of years. We got lots of places where there were civilizations and there's ruins and there's nobody there anymore, where it's desert. And we got a few places where there's still people and big cities and cultures that are thousands of years old that are farming in the same spot. And there's only a few examples of where there's still big civilizations that are thousands of years old that are farming in the same spot. And I think of the, besides the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, which is there are still ancient cities in the same spot that have been going for a long time. We've got the Nile River Valley, we've got Egypt, we've got the Indus and the Ganges River Valley, you've got the Indian culture, and we've got the Yangtze and the Yellow River Valley, the Chinese. But nowhere else do we have agricultural civilizations which have been doing agriculture and maintaining civilization in the same spot for thousands of years. Everywhere else, civilization has come. Cities came, wars, and then now we've got cities in the middle of the desert. You look in South America, the Incas and the Central America. You look in, parts of the Middle East. You can look in Africa. There's these ancient civilizations that rose and then fell. John Hamaker put forth this idea that part of the process of agriculture is when you are harvesting crops off the land is you're actually harvesting minerals out of the ground that if I'm harvesting off 20,000 pounds of crop per acre per year, most of that is carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen from the atmosphere, but some percentage of it, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds per year, is minerals from the soil. And the plants are trying to put into their seeds the most critical nutrients for next year's generation. And so when we keep harvesting those seeds off the soil, we're actually mining the soil for some of those critical elements that are needed for biochemical reactions, for enzyme system function and DNA and all that kind of stuff. So functionally, in many cases, the process of agriculture over time, over decades, over centuries, over thousands of years, is a mining process that wears out the land, especially when you're doing tillage. And so what happens in these river valleys that keeps them able to be doing agriculture for thousands of years is the annual flood. If you look at the Nile River Valley as an example, you've got the Blue Nile, which comes out of the Congo, which is a jungle like the Amazon, basically, massive, amazing jungle, and that's full of organic matter and life that's coming down in the spring flood. And the White Nile is coming out of the mountains of Ethiopia, where they've got glaciers that are grinding up the rock. And so the White Nile takes all the crushed up rock dust, and the Blue Nile takes the organic matter and the biology, and they mix, and then that gets spread out over the land, and you're able to do amazing agriculture in that same spot for thousands and thousands of years, because whatever's being taken out is being put back in on an annual basis. I can't remember, it was Palmyra that the Syrian army just took back from ISIS a couple weeks ago, what they call a desert city. There's an ancient city there which is surrounded by desert. It didn't used to be desert. They didn't build a city in the desert. They built a city in the rich plain, and then they practiced agriculture and wore out the land, and now it's desert. Right? You can look at a lot of places on the planet where there used to be rich land, and there's big old cities that used to be there, that the residue of them is still there, and it's desert. And it's because agriculture practiced the way we practice it generally wears out land. Right? There used to be 40 feet of topsoil in Illinois, now there's 4. Lots of places in Minnesota, they're down to the subsoil. They're down to the, to the rock. The soil's all gone. The dozens of feet of topsoil that were there are no longer there. It's all down the Gulf, exactly, right. Along with the fertilizer, which is creating the dead zone, which is, anyways.
I just learned that this area originally had like 16 feet of topsoil in Piedmont.
Yep, absolutely. So that form of agriculture that we're talking about, that we call agriculture, which is tillage, whether it's with a simple wooden plow and or whatever, and grain, and which is a monoculture, is a way of agriculture that wears out the land. What the Native Americans are doing here was a whole different kind of agriculture that we don't even recognize because it's so sophisticated, because they didn't have any beasts of burden, they didn't have any machinery, they didn't have any wheels, they didn't have any plows. They were working much more sophisticatedly with nature, and they were actually building soil. So that's a whole different kind of agriculture, which is what the permaculturalists are trying to talk about. And people are like, oh, you guys are permaculturalists, you don't know what you're talking about. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. It's a whole different version of agriculture, a whole different vision of agriculture. People may have heard of this book, Restoration Agriculture. Anybody heard of that book, Restoration Agriculture? Mark Shepard is a farmer from Wisconsin, I think. And he does the math on, the land of milk and honey. The land of milk and honey is where you've got lots of bees making honey and lots of cows making milk, right? You've got, in the Bible we have the land of milk and honey. The land of milk and honey, he says, is a savanna ecosystem, where you've got occasional large trees with grasslands underneath, with berries and nuts and brambles, and sure, plenty of annuals as well growing. He does the math there on how many calories you can produce on an acre, of what quality in this book, and he lays out how categorically you just blow conventional ag out of the water with a savanna ecosystem, which is basically what the Native Americans were running across the majority of the continent, was a savanna ecosystem. They were managing it for that model, and that was building topsoil, that was building soil. So I didn't talk about the carbon sequestration. I talked about how 40% of the carbon in the atmosphere that's been added since 1750 came from the soil. I didn't talk about how plants actually build carbon. I'll just get that out of the way. It's a tangent, but I want to cover it. This process of water plus carbon dioxide plus sunlight being turned into sugar and oxygen. The oxygen goes into the atmosphere, that's what we breathe. The sugar, in majority, goes into the soil. There's carbon from the atmosphere going into the soil in this equation. What are you smirking about?
It's just amazing that we didn't get it to recently. Or some of us.
Where did the 40 feet of topsoil come from? It came from the air, right? So we've got farmers in North Dakota, in Australia, all over the planet, operating on thousands of acres, not hundreds of acres, not single acres, not mulching and composting, farmers, real farmers, on thousands of acres that are increasing organic matter levels 0.5% per year, among many others. 0.5% per year. You figure out how much carbon is in 0.5% organic matter, and you multiply that by 7 billion, which is the number of agricultural acres on the planet, and it would take 3.5 years to sequester all the carbon that's been added to the atmosphere since 1750, if we performed agriculture well. Right? There were 280 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere in 1750. There's 400 now, 120 increase. 3.5 years we could sequester it all through agriculture if the world's agricultural land was being managed biologically, if plants were healthy, and as part of that process of being healthy, we're feeding the soil. When you put fertilizer into the ground, soluble nutrients, that's like an IV drip direct into your bloodstream. That's like Gatorade. That's not food, right? The biological system in your gut is not being fed when you're on an IV drip. You can be kept alive when you're on an IV drip, but you're not using your gut to digest your food as nature made it. So when you add fertilizer, you short circuit the process and you prevent this process from occurring. If you have healthy plants, which I haven't talked about yet, the full implications of healthy plants, what happens is they are indigestible to fungi. They're indigestible to insects, and then you obviate the need for fungicides and insecticides, etc. Yes?
Can you just do the run through of that equation on carbon sequestration again? I know it was
the basic process is this, and
I meant the thing that started with 0.5% per year.
If you so basically we've got enough documentation and enough continents of real farmers, quote unquote, thousands of acres farmers doing this 0.5% increase per year. So that means you start at 1%, you go the next year you're at 1.5. The next year you're at 2. The next year you're at 2.5. And Gabe Brown is somebody who started off at 1.5 and now he's at 11 in the past 20 years or something like that. And he's in North Dakota. He's operating 5,000 acres. There's a woman named, what's her name, from Australia? Christine Jones. Christine Jones from Australia has been doing a lot of work down there with 20,000 acre farmers and doing some of the really simple stuff, and increasing organic matter again, 0.5% per year, year after year. There's somewhere between 6.5 and 7 billion acres of agricultural land on the planet, according to the UN. And so if you figure out how much carbon is in 0.5% of organic matter, and you multiply that by 6 or 7 billion acres, you see how much of that is, and how much carbon's been added to the atmosphere since 1750. It's a simple math equation. It's actually Alan Yeomans' son, I believe, wrote a book called Priority 1, where he does the math out on this.
Sorry, so PA is the keyline guy. Alan is one of the sons.
PA isn't Alan? PA?
The Percival Alfred
Oh, okay.
P.A. Gilman?
is the founder of the keyline.
Okay.
I think that Alan is the one that he was talking about.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's entirely possible. I've got the book. Usually when I drive to my presentations, I bring a whole big library of books, and then you can look at this and look at this and look at this, and I just didn't drive here. What's that?
I said I almost loaded up a bunch
You
of books
almost loaded
right
up the
out,
book,
but I
yeah.
didn't have that one.
Tomorrow we might have more books. Anyway, that's my understanding of the math on a basic level. Tangent, but anybody who's a big global warming, hoo-ha kind of person, you know, and they're fighting ExxonMobil and everybody else. You know, it's like fighting Monsanto. I'm like, if you want to fight, knock yourself out. My thought is that we build solutions, and the way we solve this problem is by growing healthy food. So what we really need to be doing is talking to people about how what they're feeding their children is causing them to be sick, and if they could choose the food that tasted good, their children would eat it, and then they wouldn't be healthy, and they'd be sequestering carbon, and they wouldn't need agribusiness, so then they could be fighting Monsanto at the same time, if you want to. For me, this is a much more systemic, holistic, creating the solutions mode as opposed to fighting mode. I think it was Mother Teresa who said, I'll never attend a march, you know, an anti-march. If you want to work towards something, I'll be love to be there, but don't ask me to fight. I don't, you know, you're going to push your energy against something, or you're going to put your energy towards something. It's a bit of a conceptual, you know, shift, but I think really what we can do is create solutions. Anyways, yeah.
Be an angel and don't swing your fists.
Be an angel, don't swing your fists. There's all kinds of good ways of saying it. That's not a bad way of saying it at all. Yeah, that's exactly it. Great. Okay, so I laid out the basic idea here about remineralization and the concept that you need basic minerals. This is something I did not learn about as a farmer, you know, in the organic community. I want to teach you how to read a soil test, so you can make some, you know, mineral balancing decisions yourself. I'm going to give you a rationale behind what I'm teaching you to start off with, and then you can do with that as you wish. So what I'm going to teach you how to read a soil test is what's called an Albrecht style soil test. Albrecht was he was a scientist. He grew up on a farm in Illinois. He was a farm boy, but he ended up running the soil department at the University of Missouri for 20 years. You guys have Virginia Tech, I believe. Is that your land-grant university? We've got UMass.
Tech and University of Virginia.
Virginia State?
Yeah.
The one that does all the
Virginia State.
VSU.
VSU.
All right.
Tech
When
doesn't
people
go-
go to when people go to study agronomy, where do they go?
They go to either school, but
Either
Virginia
one.
State's the one that-
Okay, fair enough. We've all got our own systems. It's Cornell in New York. It's UVM in Vermont. You know, in Missouri it was University of Missouri, and Albrecht was the head of the soil department at the University of Missouri for 20 years. So he's a quote unquote company man, right? He's a part of the legitimate institution. He's a scientist, which is why I like to hide behind him when I'm talking about all this stuff, because you know, he ran the university soil department for 20 years. Albrecht did his grad research. I'm not sure if it was his master's or his PhD or both, looking at a very interesting factoid, which was he was overlaying World War I draft records with U.S. Soil maps. Really interesting. He saw that the percent of boys that were accepted for the draft from Illinois was dramatically higher than the percentage of boys accepted who were drafted in Alabama and Arkansas. That the boys who grew up in what we call the breadbasket were accepted at much higher rates than the boys who grew up in Appalachia. The way it was determined whether you were fit to be cannon fodder or, you know, whatever, machine gun fodder or chemical weapons fodder was whether you had good teeth and good arches. Because in the Civil War, if you couldn't march 20 miles and eat hardtack, you were going to get in the way, right? World War I, they didn't realize everybody's going to be stuck in a trench, so they had the standards from the previous major war, which was you got to be able to march and you got to be able to eat hardtack. And so if you had flat feet or bad teeth, you weren't accepted. Just like a horse. You got bad feet and you got bad teeth, you're no good. And the boys that grew up in Appalachia had flat feet and bad teeth, and the boys that grew up in the breadbasket had strong arches and good teeth. And Albrecht said, I wonder why. Were they all Germans over here and all Italians over there? No. No, they weren't. The Germans went everywhere, right? Where they, you know, it wasn't their genetic lineage. It was really clearly the soil type in the area where they grew up. Very interesting. And so we said, I'm going to study this. And-
where they had done a lot of tobacco and other trees.
Well, where we got worn out, weathered soils is where we have boys with flat feet and bad teeth, right? Buck teeth. Anybody know about the archetypes of
I had
Appalachia?
buck teeth really
And then they pushed them back.
bad.
Yeah, yeah.
And it damaged the whole jaw and everything. Yeah.
So the idea here basically is that
My mom cooked box mashed potatoes and microwave everything. So.
we are. I mean, if you understand Albrecht's work, and his contemporaries were Weston Price. People know about Price. You know about Pottinger, Pottinger's cats, right? I mean, they were figuring this stuff out a long time ago. This is the 30s and the 40s. This is a long time ago when they're figuring out that what you eat has a lot to do with your physiological development. They were feeding, Pottinger was feeding cats. They've done this with pigs. They've done this with rabbits. I mean, Albrecht did it with rabbits. He was able to get. So I'll just go the whole story. Sorry. So Albrecht took clay and he put it in a centrifuge and spun out all the cations that were attached to it, all the calcium, all the potassium, all the magnesium, spun it all out until he had pure clay. And then he would add these cations back in different ratios. So he would do 50% calcium and 10% magnesium and 5% potassium here, and 60% calcium and 15% magnesium and 5% potassium there. And he would do these pot tests, and he would grow out crops, seeds, wheat and barley and everything in these different mineral levels and ratios. And then he fed those crops to animals and watched the effect on the animals through multiple generations. Really thoughtful, really interesting. 500 plus published papers, right, by this guy. You've never heard of him, most of us, never heard of him. University land-grant researcher. He was able to get rabbits who were fed crops grown on good soil to increase their body weight, get larger in 1-2 generations, to get larger litters, to get longer lifespans. He was able to get rabbits fed crops grown in imbalanced soils to get smaller in 1 generation, to have smaller litters, to have shorter lifespans, right? Absolutely, totally impressive results, showing that the mineral levels and ratios in the soil had a profound effect on the physiological development of the animals who ate those crops. I think this is amazing information. It's ridiculous that no one knows this kind of stuff. No one knows any of this kind of stuff. What happened was after World War II, when the armaments industry had lots of factories that had been used to build, to make explosives and chemical weapons, and there was no market for all those products anymore, they said, who can we sell these things to? And they said farmers. And so what was a chemical weapon, a nerve gas, is now an insecticide. What was an explosive is now a fertilizer. And they basically said to UVM, they said to Virginia Tech, they said to Rutgers, they said, here's $5 million. I would like you to hire this guy and fire that one. And they systemically went through the land grant system, and people who were going to recommend fertilizer and chemical weapons were given endowed chairs and what do you call it when you can't get fired? Tenure. Yeah. You can look at the history. It's pretty categorical. It's like this is just simply the facts on the ground, ladies and gentlemen. Deal with it. But what we call conventional ag really is only 60 years old, right? Conventional ag, like this is the way it's always been, is really just since World War II. The USDA, the land-grant universities were doing some amazing work in the 30s and 40s. Really, really amazing stuff, as they was envisioned in the 1860s, right? As was the idea behind the land-grant universities. So, anyways, I don't recommend the use of a land-grant university soil test because they don't use the Albrecht base saturation analysis for assessing soil. They use what's called a SLAN model, sufficient level of available nutrients, and the available nutrients they're talking about are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which are the ingredients in explosives, which if you've got present in soluble in large quantities cause plants to grow really rapidly but to grow weakly, and when they grow weak then nature says you are not fit for reproduction, and then the insects, which is nature's garbage crew, comes in and kills them, or the fungus